In the early hours of June 6, 1944, long before the first rifle cracked across Omaha Beach, the most important battle unfolded in darkness and rough water inside the English Channel. Steel landing craft pitched violently as American tank crews clung to their Sherman tanks, listening to waves slam against armor plates never designed for open sea. This was the Normandy landings, the moment that would define the D-Day invasion, and it began with a decision that would quietly determine who lived long enough to fight. The original plan called for amphibious Sherman tanks to swim ashore using canvas flotation screens, a bold idea meant to bring armor forward before infantry hit the sand. But as dawn approached, commanders stared into towering seas and realized the truth. The weather had turned the channel into a graveyard. Launching tanks miles offshore would send them straight to the bottom. Radios crackled with urgent reports as officers weighed doctrine against survival. In this instant, industrial warfare collided with human judgment. A handful of naval and army commanders chose to delay deployment, ordering many tanks to land directly on the beach instead of swimming in. It was not a dramatic moment, no speeches or banners, only shouted orders and altered timelines, yet this decision reshaped the entire Omaha Beach assault. The German Atlantic Wall loomed ahead, bristling with concrete bunkers and interlocking fire, while German forces waited with confidence behind their defenses. For the American tank crews, the choice meant enduring direct fire on exposed rams rather than drowning unseen. As landing craft crept closer, Sherman crews checked ammunition, adjusted sights, and prepared to fight immediately upon disembarkation. These tanks represented more than firepower. They embodied American mass production, battlefield improvisation, and the belief that adaptability could overcome preparation. When rams finally dropped under enemy fire, the first Shermans rolled forward into chaos, not as planned spearheads, but as desperate survivors arriving late yet alive. This was the decision in the Channel, a moment rarely seen yet deeply historical, where a change in execution preserved armored strength that would later challenge German defensive mastery at Normandy. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, as dawn crept over the gray horizon, German forces along Omaha Beach waited with calm certainty. From their concrete bunkers and camouflaged trenches, they observed the approaching Allied armada with a confidence built on years of preparation. The Atlantic Wall was not a symbol but a system engineered through mathematics, overlapping fields of fire, and the brutal logic of industrial age defense. German commanders believed Normandy was a natural fortress. Steep bluffs dominated narrow beaches. Tidal flats exposed attackers to machine gun fire for hundreds of meters. Every approach had been calculated, registered, and rehearsed. For the defenders, this was not improvisation, it was execution. Inside reinforced positions, German infantry manned MG-42 machine guns capable of firing at devastating rates. Artillery batteries sat inland with pre-plotted coordinates, ready to saturate the beach with high explosive. Anti-tank guns were carefully positioned to catch armored vehicles as soon as they appeared, their fields of fire crossing like invisible blades. German doctrine assumed that Allied armor, if it arrived at all, would come late, scattered, and isolated. Any tanks that survived naval fire and obstacles would be destroyed piecemeal. This belief was reinforced by intelligence reports and wargaming exercises that predicted catastrophic losses for attacking forces. German soldiers trusted the Atlantic Wall because it had been designed to remove uncertainty. Every bunker supported another, every trench connected to a fallback position. The beach itself was transformed into a killing zone, littered with obstacles meant to tear open landing craft and channel troops into narrow corridors of death. Mines lay buried beneath sand and wire. For the German High Command, Omaha Beach was not meant to be held temporarily, it was meant to be undefeatable. As American infantry struggled through surf and fire, German defenders watched for armor, expecting none to arrive in time to matter. Their confidence rested on timing: destroy the first waves, delay organization, and the invasion would collapse under its own weight. Yet beneath this certainty lay a hidden vulnerability. The Atlantic Wall depended on rigid assumptions. It assumed control of the timeline. It assumed isolation of attackers. It assumed that armor would behave as predicted. As smoke thickened and communications faltered, those assumptions began to erode, even before the first Sherman tank emerged from the surf. By the time the first American Sherman tanks ground onto the sands of Omaha Beach, the German defenders had already begun to realize that the battle was not unfolding as expected. The initial waves of infantry, though suffering terrible casualties, were pushing forward in defiance of the withering fire. And then, suddenly, the Shermans appeared, rolling over the sand with a ferocity that disrupted the German defensive rhythm. The tanks hit the beach hard, some taking direct hits almost immediately, but enough made it through to have an undeniable impact. From the perspective of the German soldiers, this was not just a challenge of firepower, but one of psychological warfare. The sheer presence of armored American tanks now on the sand, right in front of the strong points, was a shock to the system. For the German defenders, armored vehicles were not an immediate concern. The German strategy had not anticipated them on this scale or at this stage of the assault. Tanks had always been seen as a secondary threat, something that might arrive later or in insufficient numbers. The German belief was that the Allies would struggle to land sufficient armored forces, and any surviving tanks would be isolated by the overwhelming strength of the defensive network. But the Shermans that appeared on Omaha Beach were not just fighting machines, they were symbols of something much larger. These tanks were part of the industrial might of America, mass-produced for just such an occasion. They represented not just raw firepower, but the ability to adapt under pressure, to survive, and to push forward, even when the situation seemed hopeless. The first hits came quickly. Some tanks were destroyed outright, their crews forced to abandon them or perish in flames. Others stalled, struck by mines or anti-tank fire, their mobility compromised by the relentless barrage. But a surprising number of Shermans kept pushing forward, even as they were being targeted by German machine guns, artillery, and anti-tank units. The crews, often isolated and cut off from communication with command, were forced to make decisions on their own, reacting to the immediate threats as they arose. Under fire, they adapted with remarkable speed, relying on their training, their tanks' durability, and their ability to improvise in ways that the German defenders had not foreseen. The Shermans advanced under fire, each one becoming a center of resistance as infantry followed in their wake. Some tank crews used their powerful guns to obliterate machine gun nests that had been mowing down the advancing soldiers. Others targeted the fortifications, firing direct shots into bunkers, tearing through the concrete with the help of specialized ammunition. Despite the overwhelming enemy fire, the presence of armor on the beach created a psychological shift. The German defenders, who had expected their positions to hold against infantry alone, now found themselves under assault from a new and unpredictable force. The morale of the defenders began to falter. The tanks were not just a weapon. They were a constant threat, forcing the Germans to focus on an unexpected challenge. In many cases, German soldiers were faced with the unimaginable. They were forced to fight an enemy they had not expected to arrive so soon, nor in such numbers. The tanks on the sand were no longer just a symbol of industrial power, they were a living, breathing embodiment of the American resolve, an unstoppable force that would change the dynamics of the battle. The presence of Shermans was a game-changer, altering the course of the battle. They provided crucial support to the infantry, giving them the mobility and firepower they needed to break through German strongpoints. Although many tanks were lost in the process, the survivors made their mark. As the battle raged on, the Shermans continued to roll across the beach, marking the first chapter of armored warfare under fire at the Normandy landings. As the hours passed on that fateful morning of June 6, 1944, the fate of the American assault seemed to hang in the balance. While many Shermans had been knocked out or severely damaged, the ones that survived began to demonstrate an incredible adaptability that caught the German defenders off guard. The German defensive system, designed to deal with static fortifications and infantry, now found itself facing a new kind of threat, tanks that refused to be stopped by the initial wave of resistance. The Sherman crews quickly adapted, using their tanks' mobility and firepower to break down the German defenses piece by piece. At times, they would advance on their own, firing at machine gun nests or directly targeting bunkers, all while taking incoming fire from every angle. With their radio communications often jammed or destroyed, tank crews were forced to make split-second decisions on their own, reacting to the shifting dynamics of the battle. They improvised repairs, fixed weapons, and utilized specialized ammunition like high-explosive anti-tank heat shells and canister rounds to adapt to the conditions they faced. One of the most notable instances of adaptation occurred when crews began to realize the importance of direct-fire tactics. In one famous case, tank commanders began to fire directly at the German artillery positions, even at long range. Their thick armor and long-barreled 75mm guns proved effective against the bunkers and pillboxes that had seemed invulnerable at the start of the battle. The Sherman's ability to knock out anti-tank positions and artillery allowed American infantry to push forward in the chaos of the beachhead. It was no longer just about brute force. It was about exploiting weaknesses and making the most of whatever resources were available. With no immediate German armored reserves in the area, the invincible nature of the Atlantic Wall began to show cracks. Without armor to counter the American tanks, the defenders were forced to rely entirely on their positions, which, under the constant assault, began to deteriorate. In many cases, German soldiers had to abandon their posts or reposition themselves under fire, while others found themselves outgunned and overwhelmed by the sheer persistence of the American crews. The inability to regroup, counterattack, or replenish their defensive lines allowed the American forces to exploit every opportunity. The defensive system that had been constructed with such meticulous care over the previous years was slowly falling apart, not because of a superior firepower, but because of a unique combination of factors. The industrial scale of American production had provided tanks in large numbers, enabling them to absorb losses while continuing to press forward. Tank crews, in turn, demonstrated incredible flexibility under fire, adapting to conditions that could change by the minute. And while many of the German defenders had believed they could withstand any attack, they had never truly anticipated a force that would not only absorb the blows but press on relentlessly day after day. By the end of the morning, the beachhead had started to stabilize, not entirely, but enough to allow the American forces to push inward. The failure of the German defense to quickly eliminate the threat posed by the Shermans opened the door for the Allies to gain a foothold in Normandy. The tanks, though not invincible, had done their job. They had disrupted the Germans' carefully laid plans, had inflicted psychological and material damage, and had enabled the American infantry to advance where they otherwise might have been bogged down. The fractures in the Atlantic Wall, already showing under pressure, now began to widen. The German confidence that had defined the early hours of the battle was beginning to unravel. The Shermans, though far from perfect, had broken through more than just physical defenses. They had demonstrated the adaptability of American industrial warfare, and in doing so, they had begun the process of dismantling the German defensive system. It was clear now the Atlantic Wall was not impenetrable. It was a system designed with care, but vulnerable to the persistence and flexibility of the American assault. The battle for Omaha Beach was far from over, but the presence of the Shermans had set the stage for victory. The American tank crews had proved something fundamental. In the war between industrial might and defensive mastery, it was not just the firepower or the strategy that determined success. It was the ability to adapt, to improvise, and to continue the fight when all seemed lost. The Sherman tanks, through their sheer perseverance, had given the Allies a critical advantage, one that would eventually lead to the liberation of Western Europe.